Assalamu alaikum, good afternoon, good evening, and good morning to all my viewers. Thank you very much for joining on this session of my podcast series. Previously, आप लोगों ने देखा होगा कि जो हमारे podcast थे वो different subjects के ऊपर हमने किए in terms of ESG, in terms of energy efficiency, in terms of climate change, and so on and so forth. However, today's podcast is completely and solely not relevant to those previous topics that we have discussed. This podcast is a mix of everything that we have discussed previously in our podcast series. And this particular topic that we are going to discuss today is very close to my heart in terms of being an energy efficiency expert, in terms of ESG compliance individual, as a business owner, as somebody who works in an ESG environment. This topic is very, very close to my heart. And that topic basically revolves around the transparency, the ESG, and the governance in Pakistan. It gives me immense pleasure to introduce this report, which is basically published by Transparency International Pakistan. I have read this report thoroughly, probably twice, as my bedtime reading, and I have thoroughly enjoyed reading this report. Now, the title of this report is Assessing Pakistan's Top 69 Public Limited Companies. So basically what Transparency International has done is, they have assessed 69 businesses across Pakistan, various different industries, various different clientele, and they have put everything together in this report. And in order for us to deep dive into this report, and in order for us to review the contents of this report, I have a special guest here. And the guest today with me is Kashif Ali Saab, who is the Executive Director of Transparency International, man on a mission here in Pakistan, representing Transparency International. वैसे तो काशिफ साहब does not require any introduction, but I will give you some brief background. Kashif Ali Saab is a governance and public policy expert with extensive experience in transparency, anti-corruption, and institutional governance. As Executive Director of Transparency International, he leads initiatives that promote accountability, integrity, and good governance across public and private sectors. His expertise spans across public, policy, regulatory frameworks, stakeholder engagement, and governance frameworks, with a strong focus on strengthening institutional transparency and fostering sustainable governance practices in Pakistan. This report has been prepared by Transparency International under the guidance of Kashif Ali Saab, along with his team. So on that note, we will welcome Kashif Ali Saab to this podcast. Kashif Saab, welcome and Assalamu alaikum.
Assalamu alaikum. Thank you very much, Osman Saab, for having. And it's such a pleasure to be here and talking with you. As you said, we have been conversing virtually at various occasions. So it feels good कि आज हम in person बैठे हैं और इस important topic के ऊपर बात कर रहे हैं.
Thank you very much, Kashif Saab. It's a pleasure to have you here. I am really looking forward to our conversation. And like I said to mentioned to our viewers that, I have personally read this report twice, and it is a phenomenal read. It dissects, all those 69 businesses in terms of what you have gauged, what you have been looking for in terms of international standards and so on and so forth. So without any further ado, let's deep dive into, what is there in this report, and then we'll ask you some pertinent questions in respect to the report. So, Kashif, my first and the basic question to start off this conversation is what prompted Transparency International to formulate this report? Because once I read, this report, Transparency International is not a regulator. There are plenty of regulators available in Pakistan, but what typically prompted Transparency International to come up with this report?
Yep. No, thank you, Osman Saab. Let me start by first, congratulating you and the ESG Nexus, because I think the kind of work that you and your initiative, the ESG Nexus, has done around ESG and corporate governance is incredible. We have had conversation at various points, and certainly we are very pleased to be a partner with you in this journey. Let me also start on your question by giving you an overview on the background. So transparency in corporate reporting, the assessment that is done under the methodology. So this particular methodology is developed by Transparency International, our global secretariat. And it was developed in 2014. Now, 2014 globally was a time when a lot of businesses were undergoing integrity crisis. There were examples of businesses that had suffered enormous cost because of some of the scandals that had come up at that point. So the track at that particular time, the objective was how do we assess the transparency levels of the biggest listed companies, the world's largest listed companies. And the idea was that through publication of data, we encourage them to do more on the disclosure level. Now, over the last decade, this particular methodology has been used both internationally, but also in a lot of jurisdictions nationally by TI chapters in different countries. Now, in case of Pakistan, I think इसकी सबसे बड़ी जो वजह थी वो कॉन्टेक्स्ट है, और अगर हम कॉन्टेक्स्ट की बात करें तो उसमें obviously important context is the economic context. Now, we did this report in 2024. 2024 was a year when Pakistan was under the IMF program, a $7 billion extended fund facility. Now, if you look at that particular program, when it started, it focused on a number of structural benchmarks. And those structural benchmarks essentially talked about what you highlighted. How do we reform the private sector? How do we reform the enabling environment of doing business in this country? The reforms within the tax administration, whether it's retail, agriculture, export side. And what we felt that कि जब हम reform की बात करते हैं, the private sector is the area where a lot of this reform was targeted. So the idea was कि जी जब integrity हम frameworks की बात करते हैं, transparency reforms की बात करते हैं, how do we bring the private sector in terms of generating some baseline? So that was one, I think, key factor that sort of prompted us to do some sort of an assessment that looks at the private sector. But equally important, the other factor was कि particularly अगर आप पाकिस्तान में जो transparency के around conversation है, उसको देखें तो more often it's a conversation that is directed towards the public sector. And I think most often the private sector is completely excluded out of it. So TI publishes a corruption perception index globally. And this particular index, assists and ranks countries on how well they are doing in the fight against corruption. And out of the different sources which are used in the calculation of this survey or the calculation of the assessment of the countries, there are some sources which look at the private sector. So, for example, whether the businesses, have to pay facilitation payments for registrations, for tax authorities, or for other, cost of doing businesses. And there, I think a lot of the policies that we talk within the integrity system become a part of that toolkit. So, for example, when a business has a facilitation policy that is publicly available, then you expect that not only your board of directors, not only your leadership, but your employees are also aware that facilitation payment is something that we can't indulge in, right? So the first step of that is really to look at whether do we have these basic policies in place. If we don't, are these not really existing at the organizational level, or is the disclosure is an issue? And we looked at in terms of the overall, I think, investor confidence. And I think for investor confidence, we just have to think at a very basic level. अगर आपकी या मेरी कोई company हो and we expect a foreign investor coming in to invest in that, what do we expect? We expect at least information कि जी who owns this company? whether the company has subsidiaries which operate in certain jurisdictions. So all this is a basic information that any investor would require. And I think what Track did was to sort of expand that argument and look at a more national level. Okay, if you not only look at one or two firms, if you multiply it with overall context in the country, it really creates economic infrastructure. और फिर उस economic infrastructure की obviously there is a cost both from economic growth point of view, but also from a point of view of business growth. So these were, I think, some of the factors which were really the rationale why this exercise was conducted in 2024.
Thank you very much for that. Now, obviously, what was the uptake? So I have a two-tier question here. So the first, is you have 69 companies, that are listed in this particular report. So what was the modus operandi in terms of, did you approach those businesses and say that, look, would you like to be part of this? Or did they approach Transparency International that, look, you publish a report and, we would love to become part of that? I mean, and the reason why I'm asking you that question is for our viewers to understand, the uptake, Obviously, there are plenty of reports that are published every single year throughout Pakistan through various different regulators. But what is interesting to know is that, what was the uptake from these 69 businesses?
So when we did it first time in 2024, the experience was quite encouraging. So I think out of 69, at least 32 companies interacted with us. They got back to us, they gave their feedback. काफ़ी कंपनीज ऐसी थी जिन्होंने हमें कहा कि जी ये चीज़ है जो एनुअल रिपोर्ट में लिखी हुई है, ये डॉक्यूमेंट है जहाँ पे है, and you revise our score. So again, I think given whatever the methodology allows, the scores were revisited and subsequently the report was published. So there was an implicit or explicit consent from the companies that was involved here. So this is a methodology that we interact with the company, we get their feedback, and then we publish it. Now, obviously, as you pointed out earlier, TIA is not a regulator, right? Our objective of doing this exercise is sort of an independent oversight where we generate a data that is useful for the regulator, but also for the companies. और इसी में मेरा ख्याल है कि इस point के ऊपर another encouraging aspect after the report was published, a lot of companies took it very seriously. And this was, I think, also a bit surprising to us. We heard from the companies जिसमें the board of directors meetings were called on the assessment on their score and ranking. There were companies who got in touch with us in terms of learning how to improve in the next cycle. So I think it's very encouraging in that aspect as well. But this is how the framework and the methodology looks like.
Thank you, Kashif. So you mentioned regulator. So when you say regulator, I mean, who are you referring to? Is it SECP that you're referring to?
Yeah. So again, track includes number of indicators. It includes indicators which are mandatory compliance. Now, when we say mandatory compliance is the SSCP, what the SSCP requires from the companies, what the PSX enforces for the companies, and then there are other indicators which are voluntary compliances. So in Pakistan, we have a lot of frameworks which are still voluntary. So for example, the ESG guidelines, the reporting is yet, as you would also, I think, would be highlighting later on in the conversation, the latest, requirement from the SCCP on the IFRS S1 and S2. And then I think on the human rights and the procurement on anti-corruption, we have Ministry of Human Rights, National Action Plan on businesses on human rights. So, and then globally, again, there are certain frameworks, particularly जब हम United Nations Global Compact की बात करते हैं, the Principle 10th talks about businesses and anti-corruption. So the overall framework in terms of how the companies are going to be assessed, in the track, it's a combination of both, what is mandatory in our local context, but what we are also trying to do is to introduce a value for something which might not be mandatory yet, but is going to be mandatory in the long run, given how the global landscape is evolving. So it's a mixture. The indicators are a mixture of both the voluntary and mandatory compliances.
In terms of the uptake from the 69 businesses and also, the regulator. After the publication of this actual report, I mean, what was the feedback that you got? That, look, is it good, bad, and different? I mean, you should continue publishing it every year or no stop, or, the facts, figures are not realistic. I mean, what was the feedback? So, I mean, I would request two-tier response in it. One from a summary from the 69 companies, and then a separate response on behalf of the regulator.
Yep. So as I said, I think first let's talk about the data. What does the report data shows? So ये जो track assessment है last year when we did it in 2024, it comprises of 6 broad sections. अच्छा वो 6 sections क्या हैं? A, it talks about the anti-corruption programs. It talks about domestic financial reporting. It talks about organizational transparency. Then we are talking about human rights, corporate social responsibility, gender, and then finally, the financial reporting that the companies do. Now, on this again, there is a lot of split when we talk about the data. First, there is a clear trend in terms of, if you look at the 69 companies, the compliance levels are very high in terms of what the regulator requires. So, for example, domestic financial reporting, as we know that the SCCP requires it, there are auditors who sign off on these reports. So there is a mandatory compliance that the companies have to report on it. And we saw that on average, the compliance level was 94%. Similarly, on organizational transparency, there are a lot of areas that are mandatory, such as if company has a subsidiary that operates in another jurisdiction, whether the company has disclosed the revenue generated, the amount of taxes that the companies have paid, who are the ultimate beneficial owners of the companies. Now, all these informations within our local landscape, these are now mandatory compliances. So we saw a very high level of compliance. So the average of 69 companies is 90% on organizational transparency. The problem becomes a little more, I think, when we start digging a little deeper and then go towards the areas which are not mandatory yet. So, for example, the human rights, we saw that the overall compliance was only 60%. Then on the gender and non-discrimination, again, the overall, I think, compliance level was 68%. On anti-corruption, there was the lowest compliance of 47.28%. And finally, on the procurement, again, the compliance level is just 58% on average among the 69 listed companies. Now, again, within this data, अगर हम two-tier approach की बात करें, so again, you would see that there's a clear trend that there are biggest companies, there are multinationals who take not only the mandatory requirements seriously in terms of what the law requires them, but they also go well beyond what the law requires them. So we saw also very strong statements coming from the leadership on anti-corruption. We also saw among the top companies, focusing on human rights due diligence. So that's there. And secondly, I think the problem is this particular data does not trickle down to the lower levels, right? Now, lower level, again, I'm talking about only within the 69 top companies. तो उसमें भी जो सबसे बड़ी कंपनीज है उसमें तो ठीक है ट्रेंड आपको कंप्लायंस लेवल बेहतर नज़र आएंगे सो इवन इफ विद इन दैट सैम्पल इफ यू टेक द कंपनीज हु आर ऑन द फाइनेंशियली लो even there the compliance level becomes different. So what it shows, I think, is also a concern that once you go to a mid-tier company or once you go to the non-listed companies, what would be a situation there? Because here these are the companies who look at these voluntary compliances also from a point of view of global capital access, right? Because they know that the way the capital flows now, there is more screening from a governance and an ESG and sustainability point of view. So that's there in terms of the tier approach. But on your question, Kiji, how did the companies take it? I'm very happy in terms of seeing the response to this report because I think we saw a very good response. The companies took it very seriously. The companies engaged with us. Even I think the next annual reports when they were making for 2025, there was a lot of interaction and engagement in terms of, you had this indicator, what does it mean? how to capture this. And then there are companies who took micro level data very seriously also. So for example, within anti-corruption program, एक indicator ये है कि जी क्या companies का regular anti-corruption programs हैं या नहीं है. उसमें we had few companies who engaged with us. They said, okay, look, we had weak compliance on this, and we want to come up with some tailored, programs for our employees, for our staff. And so TI came in and delivered that. So what I think from a TI point of view, the approach here really is to bridge this gap. The gap on the voluntary compliances, particularly between the top companies, and coming it down. So for example, this year we increased the sample to 109. And the idea is in the long run to also include the SMEs, to non-listed companies, so that I think this message of the increasing requirements, then it goes to all the businesses out there.
Kashif sir, those of you who haven't read the report, I encourage you to read the report. We will mention the link to download this report within this podcast. And also, once this podcast is published, we'll ensure that this link is published. It's an interesting report, and it shows a very nice trend, because I keep repeatedly saying that I've read it personally twice, because I found it, content in there, the figures, the data that I have not seen so comprehensively represented in Pakistan previously. So it's an interesting read. I would suggest that listeners and viewers download this report and read. Now, with that, Kashif Saab, I would move on to some number crunching. So, when I read the report, the overall score that I saw for all the 69 companies is around 72.3%. So just to put it very simply for our listeners, that out of 100, all these companies, the summary of that was 72.3% compliance. So I'll revert to Kashif Saab in terms of how do you see that? Is it good, bad, and different? Is it need for improvement? Obviously, there is need for improvement. It's 72.3%. But given the global economic situation, the current situation in the region, where Pakistan is playing a huge role, in that context, how do you see that 72.3% compliance?
Yeah. So as you highlighted, the overall average score of 69 companies is 72.3, and we assisted as moderately transparent. And the above the moderately transparent, there's a category of significantly transparent and then fully transparent. And in terms of scoring, it is done on a scale of 0 to 10.
Sorry, just to interrupt, and again for the clarity of viewers, not Transparency International Pakistan, but have you seen report where, the scorecard is fully transparent in any country in the world? No names, but
No, I think most of the track reports that have been done in other countries, they also highlight gaps. In our case also, we saw there were companies who were fully transparent within certain sections, but there was no company that received 100% score on average across all the sections. Right? And to your question, is it encouraging? I would say yes, 72.3 is a good score, especially talking about in 2024. And then talking about in 2024 also means that 2 years ago, there were also certain regulations which are now in place, which were not there. Right. And then also, I think from a point of view that there are a lot of things which are not mandatory required. So I think what this 72.3 shows, it shows 2-3 things. It shows that companies do very well when the regulator requires them to do certain things, right? So, and that's, I think, the clear trend that we saw within the report, that on areas where there are regulations, where there are reporting requirements, the compliance levels were very high. They were above 90, 94, 95%, near 100%. And the companies, I think, which are the biggest companies, who have resources, who have compliance teams in place. So those companies seems to be, because they do business in other jurisdictions. So for them, there is an external pressure also to meet certain requirements. So there also, I think, within those companies, we saw that the ceiling was very high. The ceiling in terms of the average score, and clearly, I think the problem is that how do we make sure that a lot of areas which are not yet mandatory but also have a strong reporting requirements, there I think we saw a very clear trend of significant gaps. And as I highlighted earlier, many evolving areas, as you know, पाकिस्तान के ऊपर अब requirements हैं कि हमारी यूरोपियन जो है हमारे exports नहीं जा सकती जब तक हम अपनी जो है human rights due diligence की requirements ना पूरी करें. Under the GSP plus, there are new requirements on us. Under the ESG, there are new requirements. So what we are talking here कि जी अगर हमने 2 साल के बाद Scope 3 emission data की बात करनी है, तो वो तो बहुत एडवांस चीज़ है. उससे पहले देर आर सम बेसिक्स दैट वी हैव टू फुलफिल, एंड दोज बेसिक्स डोंट सीम्स टू बी फुलफिल्ड व्हेन इट कम्स टू द रिपोर्टिंग. एंड द रिपोर्टिंग also has to do with the risk, right? As we discussed कि जी अगर आपका कोई भी इन्वेस्टर है, वो क्यों इन्वेस्ट करेगा जब उसको पता ही ना हो कि कंपनी में हो क्या रहा है, कि कंपनी की क्या एंटी करप्शन पॉलिसीज़ हैं दैट वुड प्रोवाइड एनी सेफ गार्ड अगेंस्ट करप्शन रिस्क to the suppliers or the people who are you doing business with. So those, I think the idea here is to really link these reporting requirements with the risk. And where the disclosures are weak, the risk becomes very high. And we have seen that कि जहाँ पे risk बहुत ज़्यादा होता है, the cost of doing business gets also increased. And that, I think, the value addition कि जी ना सिर्फ जो SCCP, जो PSX, जो हमारा corporate code of governance का code है, वो हमें कहता है, but also the evolving requirements, उसके ऊपर हम किस तरह reporting increase करें. So there, I think, again, there was a mixed response. We have seen companies who do very well and who have taken this data very seriously, but there are companies who have not yet doing very enough. That needs to be done on that side.
Thank you. So obviously, once I read through the report, there are 2 sections that prompted, visible questions. Number 1 was financial reporting. That overall scorecard was around 94%. And I take it that was because that is the regulator's requirement in terms of transparency on that. However, on the flip side, anti-corruption, which was around, I think, 47% mark,
Yeah.
So I take it again, that is not the regulator's requirement, so that is why the compliance in that is low. Am I right in saying that?
Yes.
So, I mean, how do you see this, that, financial reporting, because, let's say, I'm just giving you hypothetical, examples here, that, financial compliance is a requirement by SCCP because perhaps, we are in FATF list or an IMF program or a World Bank program and so on and so forth. Yes. But anti-corruption compliance is perhaps not on that top of the list. So that's why, the overall compliance within the business or within the environment is quite low.
Yeah.
So, I mean, why such a stark difference? I mean, financial compliance and anti-corruption, shouldn't that be working hand to hand?
Yes. No, absolutely. I think, and that's the idea कि जी जो इस तरह की चीज़ें हैं, how do we make it part of a regulatory requirement? So one of the, I think, objective of the track is to also, advocate with the regulator to make these requirements a mandatory part of the requirement. But then also for the company, because Osman साहब, at the end of the day, I think ये भी बड़ी important है कि हम किन companies की बात कर रहे हैं. ये 69 पाकिस्तान की सबसे बड़ी companies हैं. So they have, again, resources, they have everything in place, right? So for them, so for example, if you again 47 के, if we break the 47 number more, we find that around 74% of the companies said they don't have any functioning anti-corruption program or anti-corruption training programs, right? So and think about the risk. it increases a lot of risk. कि अगर किसी company में maybe a procurement head doesn't know that if a vendor is giving me a gift or a hospitality just to obtain a contract, how do I deal with it? Does my company, my hospitality policy require me to report it? Does my gift policy require me to accept it? What's the threshold? What's the threshold that an employee can take it? What is the facilitation payment? Right. So these are all the things that also have to do with the culture of the organization. And the culture of the organization, we saw that at the top companies, it's also a question of the culture, but it's also a question of the leadership, that we saw very strong statements in the, under the chairman message, under the CEO's message, that we take corruption very seriously. So the idea is that these are very important policies that need to be part of the policy framework. So for example, I'll tell you another example, KG whistleblowing practices ke upar. We saw that most of the companies reported having whistleblower mechanisms in place. But then if you go again deeper into the data, does the whistleblower policy require a two-way communication? We saw that 78% of the company had were silent on that. Now what does that essentially mean? That if you file a complaint, now that's the only end of the story, right? The second end of the part of the story is, do you hear back? Do you hear back about the action that has been taken place? And these are and these are the regular, day-to-day decision making or the ethical dilemmas that every member of the organization encounter. And the idea here is really is not one of making sure that these policies are only publicly available, but also to sensitize and raise awareness among the companies that we need regular training programs that talk about these issues at the company level. So to your question, again, I think the data is very clear, and that highlights two things: that the companies don't have to look at it just in the cost terms, in the financial terms. कि जी अगर हम एंटी करप्शन के ऊपर रिपोर्टिंग करेंगे या ESG के ऊपर रिपोर्टिंग करेंगे, it increases the cost for the company. But we also have to look at it in terms of capital. That once you have these strong frameworks, it gives you an access to markets, it gives you access to money, it gives you access to investor confidence. And for the regulator, again, I think the trend clearly shows that these things need to evolve to become mandatory part of our regulatory frameworks. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, if you recall our last webinar that we did probably in May, it was to do with the labor laws and that, and I quoted an example, of UAE, in which I said that, if you want to hire an individual, you cannot process their visa until, you meet certain obligations.
Yeah.
And the first obligation is obviously, you process the visa, you get through the initial approval. But then the second most important part is they need to have insurance. As an employer, if you don't buy insurance, that next step is not fulfilled. And then there are a number of other elements and so on and so forth. And before the actual visa is issued, they have to undergo a medical test.
Right.
Now, that is a requirement by MOHRE, which is Ministry of Human Rights and Emiratization, So that is the requirement. So you can't buck that system. You can't go around that system. So if we were to have that similar sort of situation in there, that, if we make this mandatory or if we make this a requirement under SCCP requirements, just like, financial reporting is, I'm sure it will, people will, or the businesses will work around it, basically.
We can design some policies on you. If there is a human rights due diligence checklist, TI can provide technical assistance to how to implement that. Right? So I think it has to be a combination, in my opinion, of both in terms of value addition, but also in terms of strict requirements from a legal point of view.
Thank you very much for the insight so far. So we were talking about the number crunching and the scorecard numbering and so on and so forth. So good insights, but I think the message is that if it becomes a regulatory compliance, then we will see the scorecard number going up. But if it's a voluntary compliance, then the scorecard will stay at a lower level. I think that is the thing. So let's move on to the next part, which is about again an emerging topic in Pakistan, which is ESG and the carbon market. So environment, social governance. Obviously, you are an expert in terms of corporate compliance and governance and so on and so forth. So how do you see this ESG compliance? We know that SCCP is, to the viewers and those of you who know the work that SCCP is doing on ESG and IFRS S1, S2 and so on and so forth is absolutely phenomenal. So how do you see that, the ESG reporting compliance and everything else in Pakistan in next 5 years, along with the carbon markets?
No, I want to echo what you said. I think ESG के ऊपर पाकिस्तान में बहुत अच्छा काम हुआ है in past few years, and credit to the SCCP. We have the ESG guidelines. We have now the S1, S2 reporting requirements from 29 onwards. From the SPP, the State Bank of Pakistan, we have a green taxonomy. So I think in terms of the framework, there has been a lot of evolution, and there is a lot of work, positive work that at the institution level that has been done in the last few years. Now, in terms of the ESG, again, I look at it from the data in terms of track. क्योंकि ट्रैक का जो भी डेटा है उसको भी अगर हम contextualize करें to the ESG framework, so particularly on the social and governance, the S&G side, I think it's a strong baseline, and it's a strong baseline because it caters to a lot of governance related and social related issues, which is again at the company level is a commitment that how the businesses are contributing to the sustainable development, and there, as we discussed, the numbers are encouraging in a lot of areas. There are areas where the numbers, could grow as the regulations are now growing up. But then from the ESG point of view, we also have to see that ESG, again, the limitation of the track report is that it only looks at the disclosure level, right? And so it's not necessarily a sustainability indicator in terms of what in practice is happening at the company level. But the starting point is that there are policies and which are reported and publicly available. And then और ESG की compliance भी है. I think उसको अगर हम climate के context में भी देखें, there is a lot of now conversation that is taking place, and the biggest being the access to climate finance. हमारी जो NDCs हैं 3.0, they now estimate that Pakistan need at least 565.7 billion by 2035 to deal with the effects of climate change. Now, out of this 565.7 billion, at least 35% is contingent upon the access to international finance, right? We have estimated that 15% will come from our domestic resource mobilization, the DRM. Now, where will this 35% come from? Right? So one of the instruments that the world is now looking, including Pakistan, is the carbon markets. And then for carbon markets, we again have a very good document, the voluntary carbon markets. We have the carbon markets guidelines 2024 in place. And these guidelines also provide a way in terms of how businesses can play their role in terms of helping the country to access climate finance. And again, I think just going a little back, we have a very good history. Pakistan, if you look at the CDM, which is the predecessor of the Article 6, the Clean Development Mechanism, there are at least to date 45 projects which are registered in the CDM, right? And all these projects are the projects that were registered by the private sector. Now, it's another thing that due to the price crash of 2012 onward, a lot of these projects could not materialize, their potential in terms of the financial terms. But this shows कि जी as a country हमारा private sector का बहुत potential है to come up with the projects, right? और इसी में जो अभी तक जितने भी pilot projects हैं उसमें a lot of these private sector is pitching in. I think the important point here is कि जो ESG की जो compliance है onward होगी, हमारा उसमें emission data है, baseline है, उससे भी businesses के लिए cost कम होगी, right?
Absolutely.
One issue here is कि हमारी जो अपनी national emission baseline है, वो weak है, right? हमारे पास sectoral data है, काफ़ी isolated है. If you are a company that is trying to install a solar project or a biomass project or a waste to energy generation project, when it's going to go to the external auditors, where a gold standard, the next question is, right, what is the baseline?
Yes.
And as a company, agar hamari baseline is strong, it reduces the cost which comes with these standards and all that. So I think the trend is good. We have a lot of frameworks which are in the right direction, which are good, and I'm optimistic that the market, the impetus that the market is providing to these requirements would also mean that the businesses would now start reporting more and more around the ESG as well. But let's also, I think, hear maybe some of your thoughts from your global experience in terms of how you look at the ESG market in Pakistan.
Yes, absolutely, Kashif. First of all, SCCP, has done phenomenal work in the last couple of years, as a regulator, as someone, who has provided guidance on, what the businesses require in terms of compliance, Although we say that, the S1, S2 compliance is coming in 2029, but the way I look at it, whether you call me optimistic or pessimistic, if you think about, how did the last 3 years go by? Very quick, so the next 3 years are going to come by even quicker,
Absolutely.
So, and I am personally a firm believer in systems, processes, and ownership. If there is a system in place, it will formulate a process. And obviously, if there is a process, we have to delegate it to an owner. And once all those three are in sync, it will give you results that are absolutely in line with the global economy. Now, if you think about, ESG in larger context, gone are those days that, if I am a cotton manufacturer, so, I'm manufacturing in Karachi and I'm sending it to a local client in Lahore, Now, it is the world economy where we are, There are businesses, there are larger corporations in Western world, especially in Europe, who are now demanding ESG compliance to the T. Only then they will do business. And I know, again, without naming names, I know businesses who have made this informed decision that we will not do anything in Pakistan, we will export everything, to Western world. Reason being that, they are ESG compliant. Mm-hmm. So their vendors are ESG compliant, their sub-vendors are ESG compliant, and ultimately the whole supply chain falls into one place. Mm-hmm. And everyone is ESG compliant. So a lot of people, and I'll come back to you on this, for a brief moment moving forward, but it is just having that, snowball effect. If I am, ESG compliant, I will demand that any business, any supply chain, any vendor that is associated with me be ESG compliant. And it will go further. And these checks and these ESG compliances and so on and so forth, in a country like Pakistan, we are seeing this as a hurdle. The reason for that is because we don't have the backbone or the infrastructure available now, that is why we are finding this compliance difficult. In 30 years, 40 years, 50 years time, when you and I will be retired, sitting on a beach somewhere, this will not be seen as a hurdle. Because what the work that you and I are doing now, Kashif sir, is the grassroots foundation level work that we are doing. So in organizations that will come in next 30, 40, 50 years, it will not be a problem. And a lot of people, a lot of businesses see change as difficult, but this change is good. If we follow this ESG compliance and so on, it will help businesses. So a lot of positive things happening and everything else. But going back to the basics, educate the masses. We need awareness. We need, awareness in terms of what this ESG compliance is going to do. So going back to, what you asked me, it's a good change, step change. And the $1 million thing here is that your own regulator is on board. You see, you have Transparency International. I take a lot of pride in sitting here and, discussing this report. I mean, yes, it's an international standard on track reports and so on and so forth, but to bring that vision to Pakistan, to bring that here in terms of, releasing those figures and facts, is a huge achievement. So thank you to you.
No, thanks, Osman Saab. And I think we had a very good conversation.
Yes, but before we conclude, I have two further questions just to conclude. Question about the ESG reporting. I mean, do you think that, the businesses, I'm not talking about 69 businesses, but just your view that, do you think that, businesses view that as a checklist, or is it like they are seeing it as a, yes, it's a tool to help us? I mean, just your opinion on that.
Yeah. No, as I said, I mean, in the last report, because it was done at the time when the ESG reporting was not mandatory, but still, I think the trend was good. There was a lot of businesses were already reporting on that. But as I said, it has to, on the ESG side, the real measure of it is really also beyond reporting, and there we have to introduce really the idea to the companies that the sustainability has to become a core part of the business operations. But I very much echo on what you said on the ESG, and it seems like the evolving regulations that are there now, and these things will improve. The baseline is good, is encouraging, but it is clear that the push is there, and maybe 2 years ahead when we sit again, the situation might be completely different, and there are and that's really I think in the global context as well, because as you rightly pointed out, it's not only the Pakistan's local requirement but also the requirement in which the businesses operate, the global requirement. So I would just say that I agree with what you said, and hopefully I think I'm also optimistic that these things would look different in maybe a year or two.
Great, excellent. So, Kashif Saab, thank you very much for your time and so on as we get to as we conclude this session. So, one message for CEOs, for the managing directors, for the board of directors, for the regulators, for the organizations, for the SMEs, businesses who still have to, jump on this bandwagon. One message, please.
My message would be that the disclosures, they reduce the cost of doing business. And so that's something that we have to encourage. Again, the trend is good. 72.3 average is a good number. We have to keep pushing it. And for that, I think the stakeholders need to support each other. The TI Pakistan is there to provide training, to provide assessment. The ESG Nexus is there, to do specialized, customized training for the businesses on ESG reporting. The SSP is already doing that. So I think it has to be a collective approach. It has to be a whole of society or a whole of stakeholder approach, where all of us contribute our bits. But then essentially at the end of the day, it has to come from the organizations within. And the message here is really that how do we make sure that we report on what we are already doing. Yep.
Thank you, Kashif Saab. Viewers, thank you very much for listening and tuning into this. Today's podcast, I would recap. was with Kashif Ali Saab, who's the Executive Director of Transparency International Pakistan. And we talked about corporate transparency, ESG, and governance in Pakistan. Stay tuned for more information and for upcoming podcast on this. As I mentioned in the beginning, that this is a series of podcasts that we are going to be doing. So you will see Asad Saab and I, doing more sessions. On that note, thank you very much for tuning in, and thank you very much for joining us. And we will be posting links to download these reports. And before we go, I would show this report here again that Kashif Saab and his team, have published, in terms of the 69 businesses that were reported in Pakistan in 2024. Thank you very much for joining.
Thank you
Kashif
very
Saab.
much, Osman Saab. Thank you.
Inshallah, speak to you soon.
Yes. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.